It doesn't seem to be a particularly controversial take to say that Miller's Girl is a pretty bad movie. The consensus is already there. From the unoriginal story concept to the terribly slow pacing and incredibly pretentious dialogue like,
"Don't you get scared walking through those woods?"
I'm the scariest thing in there.
This movie is pretty hard to get through, but next to the technical failings, this film also aligns itself with the dozens of work of fiction before it in failing the Lolita concept. This is yet another masterclass in how not to do that Lolita. It is not the first of its kind and it won't be the last. Imagine myself shocked when I figured out this movie was made by a woman, because the way these characters act with each other feels like the ultimate male fantasy. But I will explain. First, however, I want to talk about the Lolita concept as a whole. Part 1. What is a Lolita? The term Lolita originates from the 1955 novel by the same name written by Russian-American novelist Vladimir Nabokov. The novel is extremely controversial and scandalous to a point where it was even banned at some point, for example in France and England. The novel is about the French literature teacher Humbert's sexual obsession with a 12-year-old girl called Dolores, whom he privately calls Lolita. He moves in with a woman named Charlotte, who is Dolores' mother, and proceeds to even marrying her in order to be close to Dolores. He even becomes Dolores' legal guardian after Charlotte's untimely death. He sexually abuses her throughout the entire story. So the most important aspect of this book is that it is told from the perspective of the adult man who is actively fetishizing and sexualizing an adolescent girl. From his perspective, it feels like Dolores is toying with him and teasing him. Humbert is regarded as a textbook unreliable narrator because the things that Dolores wants and does on purpose come down to his very own desire-driven observations and do not equal the reality of what Dolores is actually intending. He actually has had obsessions with young girls even before Dolores. He describes her as an infant, a young woman not only considered to be sexually attractive but also sexually precocious. So what he does here is putting agency on her in order to justify acting on his predatory desires. He deliberately puts her in the aggressor role and victimizes himself for falling for her seductions. Knowing more about the detrimental, long-lasting effects of child abuse and the complicated psychology behind children who are taken advantage of by adults, condemning Humbert's views is as important as ever.
I think I like this little life.
It is a narrative often found in these cases where the victim child is demonized into a femme fatale, a cruel mistress, a girl without emotions, which is simply victim blaming that we see in all kinds of sexual abuse. By the way, if you want to read a story like this from the victim's perspective, I can recommend My Dark Vanessa. In my opinion, it succeeds in showing the mental gymnastics the predator goes through in justifying having a relationship with a child, and also the mental disconnect that makes a child go through with it. It shows the very reason why these relationships are so detestable. Children cannot possibly give consent because they do not understand what is really happening to them. With My Dark Vanessa, these complex feelings during and years after the abuse are so well depicted. It is important to understand that the femme fatale trope is pushed onto these girls from an outside perspective. It is how they are viewed and fantasized as by the adult. There are several film adaptations of Lolita, for example the 1962 film by Stanley Kubrick, who simultaneously fails to display the delicacy of the concept and falls into the hypersexualization traps that Humbert himself has been telling himself he's falling into. For example, it was Nabokov's wish to not depict a young girl on covers, which Stanley Kubrick and almost everyone else have gladly ignored. I want pure colors, melting clouds, accurately drawn details, a sunburst above a receding road with the light reflected in furrows and ruts after rain, and no girls. This has led to a further sexualization of the character in pop culture. The 1997 film by Adrian Lyne is, in my opinion, an even worse offender of this. Being made in a time that showing eroticism in film was more possible in Hollywood, this movie really indulges into Humbert's fantasy. This film has been romanticized to death. For me personally, there should have never been a Lolita film adaptation. I don't think they should exist because the story doesn't translate well to film. There is just too much stylistic glamorization involved when it comes to cinema. Lolita as a love story. Besides the failing in reception of Lolita as a femme fatale seduction story, there's also the reception of it as a love story, which is equally misguided. A forbidden love story trope in connection to a teacher-student romance is a trap that Pretty Little Liars also fell into when depicting the relationship of 16-year-old Aria for her literature teacher Ezra, who needs to be in jail.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
By the way, did you also ever notice how the teacher character is almost always a literature teacher? I find that to be very interesting, but ultimately I think that's not a coincidence. I think that literature offers a great way to make both characters see how they connect on an intellectual and also personal level. These stories really live through the "she's the only one who really understands the delicate aspects of life," which also plays into the "she's so much more mature than the rest" trap. I don't think you could depict this as well with an algebra teacher. The answer is 2.4. Oh my gosh, she's such a mature woman. Aria and Ezra are egregiously characterized as soulmates within a world that just won't accept or understand them because of social norms.
We met before school started this year.
I wanted you to know that this started before Aria was assigned to my class.
What started?
Wait, what do you mean before she was assigned to your class?
She wasn't my student then.
She wasn't your student then? If this is true, what you're telling us.
It is.
No.
What I'm hoping can happen is that...
No, listen, what is going to happen is you are going to leave this house right now.
The showrunners of that shit show not only demonize everyone who antagonizes the relationship, but also rewards them for going through with it by giving them a happy ending. But I digress, we can now return to Miller's Girl. Part 2. Miller's Girl. So, since the Lolita novel existed, the young woman in these stories was constantly misunderstood as someone who purposefully pursues and manipulates older men into sexual situations. And as you might have figured out by now if you don't know the movie, Miller's Girl aggressively runs into this understanding as a bird crashes into a window in full speed. This movie has truly taken the 2014 Tumblr Lolita aesthetic and went rampage with it. Miller's Girl is a story that should have never been written. In this story, the unusually gifted literature student Cairo Sweet, which is an incredibly dumb name, takes a course on creative writing. Her high school teacher, Mr. Miller, takes a liking to her and, as per usual, develops an attraction to her. Both also develop an intellectual relationship to each other, which is really annoying.
I'm assuming that you got one of these before.
I read the whole list.
Well, there's 12 books on that list.
Party hard.
Of course, the flirtatious here and there gets progressively more chaotic. From here on, I will spoil the movie, so if you for any reasons want to experience that great twist that is not at all predictable, stop here, I guess. I would not recommend watching this movie because it's not only really offensive, it is also really boring. Save your time. Since Cairo Sweet is such a genius mastermind, manipulator, high IQ girl boss, of course she used her teacher in order to elevate her writing. Somehow this movie manages to demonize all of its female characters. Firstly, Cairo is characterized as a manipulative, self-serving young woman who puts her own interests above other people. Mr. Miller's wife is the typical unempathetic, workaholic woman who stopped giving her husband love and attention a long time ago. This kind of character really annoys me. It is the kind of character you find in Colin Hoover books. They serve merely to further justify their husband to cheat on them.
And by the way, I love teaching.
You're better suited for it, I think, anyway.
I'm a writer.
You haven't put pen to page since your stories got panned. You're not a writer.
They are designed to make you as a viewer root for the affair because where else should the man get the attention he deserves?
I've been suspended.
What, now suddenly you feel worth something? Is that it?
Yes! She made me feel worth something. What does that tell you?
After all, it would make him look really unlikable when he cheats on his loving and caring wife, with his student at that. let's better make her an asshole, so it's kind of her fault when he goes on and cheats on her. This is the very narrative that is as old as time and goes, I wouldn't have cheated if you would love me more. Get a grip. If you're unhappy in your relationship, quit the relationship. Also, the person you're cheating with is still in high school. It's your student and that's entirely on your own. By the way, Cairo is 18 years old in the movie, so she is of age. I don't know if they edit this to make it less controversial, but a teacher-student relationship has such an inherent power dynamic that this really doesn't save the movie from being offensive. Also, I want to emphasize just how obnoxious every single character in this speaks. Not only are the dialogues really unauthentic and absurd, every character has the same way of talking. And unfortunately, they all talk all the time. This school seems to have only 2 teachers and only 2 students, and they all suck. They all have this snarky, witty and pseudo-intellectual personality that makes their back and forth sound really pretentious and overwritten. Cairo herself is probably the worst offender in this. She sounds like straight out of a cringy, not like the other girls' Wattpad story, where you just feel like the author really tried to make her sound smart and elegant by making her use big edgy words and say really cryptic things. The tone of this movie in general is very melodramatic. I find the color grading and the set design to be very reminiscent of mystery or gothic films. However, I don't really know what this movie ultimately strived for. This movie has almost no redeeming qualities, except for maybe the performances of Jenna Ortega and Martin Freeman, who could only do so much with the script. I'm a big fan of Jenna Ortega. I think she's a lovely and very talented actress. I just wish to see her in better projects. The biggest flaw with Miller's Girl remains, however, in the implications of this movie, in its politics. I already stated that teacher-student relationships are characterized by a power dynamic where the person who holds the structural power is the teacher. They are legal adults and have been for a long time. Plus, they are within the setting of the school, literally in power over their students. Miller's Girl, however, is not like the other girls. You see, Cairo is the one pulling the strings.
I'm testifying against him in front of the school board. Why? This is, to date, my greatest achievement.
She is using her teacher to get what she wants. So she's in charge, right? Right? Well, aside from this kind of thing only happening in movies, because 18-year-olds are not like that. Nobody is, except for maybe movie supervillains. This really messes with the question of who is at fault here. I mean, she even threatens him to make the relationship public. The narrative of women using their powers over men to wrongfully accuse them of sexual misconduct and ruin their lives is something every victim that comes forth has to a degree work against. This narrative strengthens the notions of woman evil and manipulative and is ultimately harmful in my opinion. Where normally you'd agree that the teacher is at fault even if the student is flirty with them, here we go back to the notion of the nymphette who is seducing the poor old man. I know Humbert from Lolita would love this film because it confirms a lot from his worldview. I think the director probably had more of a gaslight gatekeep girlboss approach to this, but honestly, I refuse to think that feminism is at fault here. By the way, I refuse to think that her stupid assignment was worth going through all of this. Also, if she needed all of this to write a good essay, she might not be such a great writer after all. This should come as a given, but if you want to be a writer, you need to be able to write about things that you haven't been through yourself. Her motivations are honestly psychotic. Also, I hate the fact that Cairo is seemingly written to be a lesbian. Cairo's friend Winnie, who sets the idea of using Mr. Miller for her assignment, being into Cairo, but also doing the same thing to a different teacher, made my brain rot. It makes no sense. The scene of them making out in order to manipulate the men around them feels so exploitative. Yeah, so in the end, Miller's Girl ultimately failed on every level. I think it was made with the sole purpose of being sexy and scandalous and maybe popular for TikTok edits and ultimately sacrificed telling a story of any merit. It's just a pseudo-poetic mess drawn drenched in a shallow Tumblr goth aesthetic that I think ultimately won't be remembered by anyone. So, have you seen Miller's Girl? What do you think about it? Share your thoughts in the comments if you'd like. Until then, thank you for watching.